Thank you all very much for joining us tonight for the first Coalition for Global Prosperity annual lecture. We've taken a bit of a gamble by calling it an annual lecture because, of course, if tonight doesn't succeed, this will be a one-off lecture. But our hope is very much that we will return every year for an annual lecture. For those who aren't familiar with our work, the Coalition for Global Prosperity, or CGP for short, exists to champion the UK as a force for good in the world. And we bring together political, military, business, and faith leaders who believe that an effective development budget, working alongside an active diplomatic and defence strategy, keeps the UK at the forefront of saving lives, alleviating poverty, and bringing freedom, security, and prosperity to those who need it most. And in keeping with CGP's innovative approach to engaging policymakers, tonight will be less of an annual lecture and more of a conversation, which you are all very much invited to participate in when we get to the Q&A. To start things off, Aliona Hlivco, who I will introduce shortly, will help set the scene for us and frame the discussion to follow. Lord Heseltine and I will then have a chat about the state of the world and what we might do to fix it. And then I will invite you all to put your questions to both Aliona and Lord Heseltine, and we are going to accomplish all of that in about 57 minutes. So lots to get through. So without any further ado, I will introduce our two speakers. Aliona Hlivco is Managing Director at the Henry Jackson Society and a member of the CGP Advisory Council. She is a foreign policy expert with a background in global affairs and strategic communications. Aliona is a guest lecturer in various UK and US academic institutions and a regular expert voice on global affairs in international media. Aliona has had an extensive career in Ukrainian politics, serving as an advisor to the former Prime Minister of Ukraine and holding positions in the Chernihiv Regional Parliament and the Ministry of Infrastructure. She focused on international cooperation, public-private partnerships, and decentralization. Aliona held a public office and was a member of the Regional Parliament from 2015 to 2018 before moving to London. Aliona holds an MA in Political Science and an MPA from the Chernihiv National University in Ukraine, and she is a recipient of the Order of Merit for her service in supporting democracy in Ukraine during the Revolution of Dignity. Lord Heseltine was a Member of Parliament from 1966 to 2001. He was a Cabinet Minister in various departments between 1979 and 1986, and between 1990 and 1997. He was Deputy Prime Minister from 95 to 97. He is founder and chairman of the Haymarket Group, a privately owned media company. In 2015, Lord Heseltine was appointed by the government as an advisor to the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. Within his remit, he was chair of the Thames Estuary 2050 Growth Commission, co-chair of the Estate Regeneration Advisory Panel. He published an independent report making recommendations to further develop the Tees Valley area and was also a commissioner for the National Infrastructure Commission. In October 2012, he published No Stone Unturned in Pursuit of Growth, an independent review into how the public and private sectors in the UK work together to create wealth. In June 2019, he became president of the European Movement. And now to kick things off, please join me in welcoming Aliona Hlivco.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a privilege to be here and to try to resolve all the global problems in 57 minutes. We indeed are living in very troubling times. The two global wars raging at our doorstep, and I'm saying global because they are inevitably in today's globalized world, are affecting all of us, and we can no longer shut ourselves off of those. The United Kingdom has been very generous in opening its doors to Ukrainian refugees, and about 200,000 of Ukrainian, mostly women and children, have come to this country, with so many Brits generously opening the doors of their homes and the UK government backing that with some state funding to make sure that they feel safe here and that they actually look forward to returning to the country where they belong. At the same time, the United Kingdom has provided £237 million in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Besides all the military spending, besides the 2 training programs on defense, the latest one having trained 30,000 soldiers here on the UK soil, one of whom was lucky enough to be my brother, who's just left the country 2 weeks ago. The United Kingdom has definitely foot the bill on the war in Ukraine. And before we had the opportunity to actually exhale, to see that war through, and to make sure that Europe is back to peace, we had to witness another war break out in the Middle East. And while the United Kingdom was really unequivocal with its support towards Israel, standing up and having the right to defend itself against the brutal terrorist attack, it has done so much to support the civilians fleeing from Gaza, dedicating to date, only in the last few weeks of this conflict, £30 million of humanitarian aid to those trying to flee the war zone. According to the UN estimates, there's about 18 million of Ukrainians facing the need for humanitarian aid in winter in Ukraine, and that's only in Ukraine. So many other issues are arising in the world, along with the Hamas war in Middle East, along with the ongoing refugee crisis with migrants coming from Africa. All of that needs to be absorbed by the United Kingdom. Now, to date, the UK has been one of the biggest donors to humanitarian aid and international development, but surely the resources are depleting. And we need to start thinking about how all of the emerging crises that inevitably will only keep increasing, unfortunately, with many economic crises, with conflicts flaring up across the world, with climate change being also a new challenge that we all need to brace ourselves for, especially in the global south, the countries from which all the migrants will be coming from. This is something that the United Kingdom will inevitably need to face. With its stronger partnerships, transatlantic ties with the United States, and of course more ambiguity and uncertainty coming in 2024 with the election cycles, not just in the US, but also in the UK, in European Union, the challenges will be presented there. Now, as a young managing director of a think tank, similarly to Ryan, I try not just to lead on the research and exploring the threats and naming the numbers, but also actually trying to come up with solutions to all the issues that we raise. It's been said many times that we are entering the new world order. It's a multipolar world where every single agent has now got the chance to actually make their own stance in the world. The United Kingdom has made that attempt with leaving European Union. Now, whether that was the right or the wrong decisions, I think the next generation will judge, but we need to accept that that is a given fact. And that is the United Kingdom seeking its agency in the world. So many other countries who perhaps never had that leadership role in the world are going to be seeking that too. And this is the time now, because as the global leaders keep saying, we are at an inflection point. This is the time for institutions like Coalition for Global Prosperity, like Henry Jackson Society that I lead, like many other organizations across the world, NGOs, businesses, thought leaders, to come together and come up with tangible solutions going forward. As we're seeking to build new alliances geopolitically in the world, it's very important to align with Europe, especially to tackle the migration crisis. In today's world, in the world of global wars, we need to understand that migrants who are seeking refuge in the United Kingdom are not just the misfortunate ones fleeing poverty, but they could also be used as the tool of war. In the age of hybrid warfare, we have seen weaponization of migrants on the borders of Belarus and Poland just 2 years ago. We're witnessing the same thing by the Wagner Group, weaponizing migrants from several African countries and sending them towards the shores of Italy and them ending up in Europe. We need to find tangible solutions through partnering with allies in Europe, countries like Italy, Germany, France, the United Kingdom. We will all have this burden to share and to come up with solutions. So that will call for new geopolitical alliances. At the same time, this multipolar world doesn't need to be purely horizontal and geopolitical. we need to work with business. And I love that that's exactly what Coalition for Global Prosperity focuses on, and that's something that Ryan just talked about. The vertical multipolarity and cooperation is the key to addressing these global challenges. The latest UN Security Council on this matter, on private-public partnerships, that was held in September, hosted leaders of some of the biggest businesses in the world. A very good friend of mine, Jared Cohen, who's the president of Global Affairs of Goldman Sachs, has reiterated the point that big businesses are there to lead on international development, on private-public partnerships, and they're there to be directed and to be utilized by governments and international aid organizations who see the points in the world that need aid, who can build a relevant strategy with thought leaders like us here tonight, and who could deploy the capital that they have, if only they're being directed. So I think the bright future lies ahead of us. We do have the resources that we need. It's just about developing the smart strategy, allocating the tasks amongst all the actors that we have without alienating anyone, resolving current conflicts, and effectively coming out of those conflicts stronger, stepping into the new future in a more advanced way. And similarly to my home country, Ukraine, I know that after all the destruction that we're facing now, we will eventually, with the reconstruction effort, through private-public partnerships, through international aid, we will come out of it stronger, greener, more modern, and more prosperous. And that could serve the future for the international alliances. Thank you.
The Marshall Plan, if my history serves me correctly, was an American initiative enacted in 1948 to support Western Europe, which was on its knees after the Second World War. Why do we need a new Marshall Plan, and why should the UK be the one to lead it?
You're right in your historic analysis. It was an American gesture to rebuild the war-torn Europe, and much to be grateful for. Why do we need to think again? Well, patently, the present situation is not working. Secondly, it's going to get worse. Climate change, as Aliona has said, war, conflict, but above all else, this. Because if I was sitting in sub-Sahara Africa and I got a couple of young kids, I would see every day that there's a better world. And it's not the idlers and shirkers who take the risks to come here. It's the brighter, more energetic, more entrepreneurial people. And in a way, the people those countries can least afford to lose. And so, given that my analysis, it's not mine, everybody's analysis, is that this is a huge problem involving politics, economics, and morality, one has to sort of wonder what can be done. And you look at the boat people coming across the channel, and you say, well, can we stop it? Well, who knows is the short answer to that, because there are policies that are promised. There's some evidence that the agreement with the French has diminished the scale, that the agreement with Albania to repatriate has had a significant effect. And so perhaps it will work, and perhaps the judgment tomorrow will green light the Rwanda deal. But my guess is that this actually is not going to solve the problem. And if you look at the immigration situation in this country, the scale of it is dwarfed way above the effect of the boat people. There are tensions associated with immigrants, and we would be naive to think that it's just a lot of loudmouth people on the right wing of politics. It is in the human nature to be hesitant about the neighboring tribe, about people who are different, dress differently, have different languages, eat different foods. We all know that within the human condition, there is this initial reaction. I happen to take the view that this country is probably the most commendable of dealing with a multiracial society. I'm not saying we're perfect or in any way, but I do think that if you look at what has happened with the immigrant community in this country, it is quite apparent that you can get to the top and you can be admired for doing so. So, given that this is going to be continuing for the foreseeable future, given the effect that it's having on the polarization of societies, in this country, the Reform Party has now got 6% of the vote. 6% of the vote largely from the Conservative Party. So what does the Conservative Party do? Does it edge in their way? Does it fight them? Well, there'll be plenty of people who say we need the votes. And my own sort of judgment is that we need to see this on a bigger scale, that we in the UK cannot realistically find a solution on our own. Well, there's only one possible coalition that we could have any influence over, and that, of course, is the European continent, where we are not, if I may use the language, we're not the host country. The host country is Greece, Italy, and they are carrying a hugely disproportionate burden of the pressures to join the more affluent northern societies. So there is a coalition of interest. We should help them to contain the numbers coming, and we should be part of a process. Now, the moment you say that, you come straight up against the moral judgment about the sort of world you want to live in. You're talking about walls and guns and all of that sort of thing. And that's to protect our way of life and our living standards and let them go hang. So one wonders, what is the moral answer? And then you hit the obvious conclusion that if you're going to take a tough line on immigration, you have to try and show the countries from which the immigrants are coming that it's worth their while to stay, and you're going to help them to stay. I called it a Marshal Plan in an interview I gave. I've never made a speech on the subject before, but I was asked a question and I answered it. And I remember the Marshal Plan. I mean, I was there. It was in my childhood, but I remember it. And so the morality, coupled with the knowledge that you have to protect the numbers coming into your country, demands some sort of Marshall aid program. Well, of course, we're already spending significant sums of money in aid. But of course, each country will have its own package of aid, which means that many of us will be doing very similar things, and we won't have the advantage of scale. Now, my real, dare I say it, expertise in politics is urban regeneration. And I was involved in the regeneration of East London and central Manchester and Liverpool. And the lessons that I learned there are very similar to the lessons that I think apply to a Marshall Aid plan. The essence is that you are going to try and create wealth in the countries you're talking about, and that's a difficulty. Because if you were working in the aid, politics of aid, very understandably and humanely, you see starving children and disease-ridden families and filthy water or none of it, and you do what you immediately try to do to cure them, protect them, whatever it may be. But of course, that only maintains, to a degree, the problems that are there. And the only way that you can take a different course is to try and create wealth. And that means either more money or using the existing money in different ways. And then you're up against the problem of corruption, because a lot of the governments from the countries from which these people are seeking to escape are, frankly, corrupt. Any money that goes through, there's a high risk it will be filtered off into the hands of those who are administering the machinery of government. So there's no easy, short solution to any of these things, but I take the view that we should use our aid programs, either in existence or larger, in partnership with the huge spending power of Europe, and to use a significant portion of it for wealth-creating purposes. And if you're going to create wealth, you will inevitably find yourself in partnership with the private sector. Certainly, my whole experience of regeneration demanded partnerships, and what I call gearing. In other words, for every pound of public money, you get the private sector to add. And that can be significant. In East London, for example, for every pound of public money that we were spending, we got 10 pounds of private investment. Even Liverpool, in the darkest days and the most extreme conditions, for every pound of public money, we got £1.50 of private money. So creating a wealth-creating coalition within the host communities is a very important part of the strategy. It has its problems. I've mentioned corruption, inefficiency, bureaucracy, all these things. But doing that and finding the money in order to fuel the development that I'm in favor of encouraging seems to me a sensible approach, an economic approach, and a moral approach.
Thank you. So Aliona touched on the presidential election later this year and was far too diplomatic to mention the Donald Trump scenario. But the polls suggest that he may well become president again. This is not a man known for his commitment to multilateralism. So how can the UK lead on some of these issues when there is a US president pushing possibly in the opposite direction?
Well, of course, if I could wave a wand, which I can't, we'd be back in the European Union tomorrow. It is, in my view, the worst peacetime decision that's been taken in my lifetime. We are European. We always have been European. All our history is about Europe. And we fought either on the territory of Europe or in the imperial expansion of the 18th, 19th century, fought the Europeans and other parts of the world for supremacy. And if I have one memory about the end of the Second World War, and I lived through the Second World War, if I have one memory, it was the overarching determination of the European people that it should never happen again. And the vision is what today is represented by the European Union. And it seems to me self-evident that Britain should be a leading part of that. and that we have done ourselves a great disservice and Europe a great disservice by pretending that we can wave a flag across the world and have an influence anything like the scale of the United Peoples of Europe. It's not real. Now, what I would be the first to say is that the world is not known for cooperative ventures. And it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, there are a whole stack of people out there in the world who haven't got the slightest interest in real international cooperation. I don't think there's much motivation in Iran for it. I don't think the Chinese are particularly interested in it, to just name two obvious cases. But you can get far more dramatic and worse cases in many ways. If you think what's going on in the Sudan, I mean, you know, Syria, what do we think about that guy? We come and talk about international cooperation. So I don't myself take the view that there's a thing called an international coalition. It would be very nice, but that smacks to me of the League of Nations of 1918 when it was a dream and so has remained. But Europe, that is not true. I think that Europe is faced with a challenge on immigration, which is having profound effects on its politics. And we have a framework of decision-making and cooperation. And the short answer, of course, is that Britain should play a role, but it will only do so if it recognizes that it has to take Europe with it.
And we know that personalities impact politics, and Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary at the time of Marshal, the Marshall Plan of 1948, was instrumental in turning that idea into a plan. Now that Lord Cameron is Foreign Secretary, how much of an impact will he have on some of these issues?
I have not talked to David Cameron about these issues, but he was the Prime Minister who took British aid to 7% of GDP, and 0.7% of GDP, and it's subsequently come down to 0.5, I think, and he was a committed European. So I would myself believe he would be very sympathetic to the broad thrust of the argument without committing him to a Marshall aid program or anything of that sort. But my guess is he would be sympathetic to this sort of language.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose the million-dollar question, and I recognise lots of colleagues from the NGO sector in the room, that people will have is, when we think of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the situation in Ukraine, Sudan, Yemen, unfortunately the list could go on and on. How does the UK, if it's playing that convening or leading role, look at the world and say, this is what we prioritise? How does one go about tackling that question?
Well, you can either do it with your own aid program and your own foreign office, and there's every argument for so proceeding along those lines. But I'm afraid I can't resist the word Toy Town, that what we could contribute is so small a fraction of what Europe could contribute if it were organized and if the resources were planned centrally to get the maximum value for our buck. Now, I've never been in the Ministry of International Development, so I've never experienced it, although I think I understand the politics of it. But what I have been is in similar circumstances, and the most significant one that I remember very vividly was space. And this was in 1973. I was Minister of Aerospace, and a file arrived on my desk saying, "Minister, would you be kind enough to sign this away? we need £6 million for British companies to compete with the French and the Germans. You know what the French and Germans are like. They're always a bit sharp out there. So if we just give our lads another £6 million, and that'll help for the time being. And so I said, well, I, of course, so keen on helping British companies and all of that, but before I sign away this £6 million, would you be kind enough to just do a little research for me? I want to know what is the total spend of Europe on space, and what is the total spend of the United States on space? And very rapidly they came back, 200 million Europe, 1.2 billion America. And they were asking me for £6 million in order to try and catch up with the French and the Germans. So I said, well, look, I'm sorry, I'm not signing this because I know perfectly well that the embassies will be back to Bonn and to Paris, and there'll be extra money put into the German and French programs. So I said, we'll have a European Space Agency. And what does Britain want out of it? We want leadership of the satellites. We got leadership of the satellites, the French got leadership of the launcher, and the Germans got leadership of the post-Apollo program. But all of a sudden, we were playing in a different ballpark, and we were able to specialize within Europe. We weren't all trying to run different rocket launchers. We weren't all trying to join different parts of the post-Apollo program. And Britain got the leadership of what they wanted, which was the satellites. So, I mean, it's not about international aid, but it is a very clear example of how if Europe comes together in a specialist field, then you can get specialism, you can get concentration shared across Europe, and you can get much more effective policies. It's not different from what's just happened now with the Horizon program, which Britain opted out of Europe, it opted out of the Horizon program, and British scientists went mad because they had been cut off from the European research programs. It's the same stuff. We live in a world, a shrinking world, in which the ability of any one nation state to compete in the multiplicity of technology is very limited. I told you the story of 1973. Let me tell you the story of 1985, when General Abrahamson came to see me. I was Defense Secretary. And he said, very nice to see you, Secretary of State. I am here to talk about the Star Wars program. And there'll be people here who know about Star Wars. This was the electronic screen which prevented missiles attacking the United States of America or, if appropriate, its allies. And General Abraham said to me, and Secretary of State, I have got the budget from President Reagan to make this work. $29 billion. And Secretary of State, he said, I could spend $100 million today in partnership with Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, who are at the leading edge, and he mentioned some technology. And I think he thought that I would say, my dear General, this is the most generous offer. What I heard him say was, Secretary of State, I have got $29 billion, and I know where every leading edge of technology relevant to the project exists, and I'm going to do a partnership with all of those places. And of course, the American industrial base will benefit from all of that, and it's called Silicon Valley. Anyone who thinks the private sector created Silicon Valley does not know what's going on in the world. And it was a product of the American space and defense programs. So all of these relevances build up in my experience that if you have a huge problem, it's better to see where the resources will come from, how you can get the best use for those resources, and to recognize that the other guy's got some sort of argument that you better listen to. Don't just go around the world saying this is what we're going to do. I think Trump is making mistakes of that sort, but my own experience is you have to find partnerships, coalitions, and you have to recognize that there's some cause for anxiety on the other side of the argument, which you better try and address. Hence, one coherent strategy, one moral process.
Aliona, I want to bring you in a moment, but before I do, one last question from me, Lord Heseltine. We have some people in the room, and I won't identify them, put them on the spot, but we have some people in the room who will be candidates at the next general election, Conservative and Labour. They will face questions on the doorstep from members of the public, their prospective constituents, who will say, I'd like to spend money overseas, but I'm struggling to pay the bills. What would your advice be to them as they seek to reconcile a commitment to helping the vulnerable in other countries whilst also acknowledging their responsibilities to their prospective constituents?
Well, I would have to, you're putting me in a very false position for this very simple reason. I am not responsible for the policies of the major parties. And so on the doorstep today, what I would say if I was in charge is quite different to what they will say. And frankly, they're both boxed in. There isn't any obvious sign that I can see of either of the big parties, or any of the parties, actually have policies that are going to seriously change the way in which this country is governed. And I mean, if you've asked the question, I think we are grossly centralized. We're functionally divided, transport, housing, health, education, all these things, imposing their policies on 300 local authorities. We need 60 local authorities, which the Redcliffe Maud report identified in 1968. There were 1,300 then. They're now down to 300. We need 60. We need directly elected mayors, because if you have 60 councillors running a council, you don't get a leadership who's got power. They're all in the hands of their own particular pressure groups. And you need to give a far greater emphasis of the decision-making and investment programs coming from a strategy based on the local economies. Now, nobody's going to say that, but that's what should happen.
Mm-hmm. Before I come to our audience, Aliona, given you were not based in the UK until a few years ago, if the UK were to step up and play a leading role in a future Marshall Plan of some sorts, how do you think the rest of the world, particularly the UK's allies, would view that?
I think the United Kingdom is in an extremely unique position to set the tone in the world. Despite, as one would say, probably a grave mistake of Brexit, my personal view, of course, we are now in a position, and I'm saying we because I am now identifying as a Brit, and I want this country to succeed. We're in a position of being almost in the center of the world. When I speak to many stakeholders in the United States, they are looking at Europe with uncertainty of support from Europe. They don't know how much they can rely on the EU, for example, to foot the bill for the Ukraine war. They feel like they need to come in and fight Europe's war here at their own expense. They feel like they can't really rely on the EU in standing up to China and any threats and risks coming from there. When it comes to Europe, and when I speak to policymakers there, in France and in Germany, going back to my most recent conversations, they are looking towards the UK to be that intermediary in talks with the American. They're also quite anxious about Donald Trump coming into office. I know for sure that the German government and the foreign ministry under Annalena Baerbock are now doing AI modeling and forecasting what happens if Trump comes into power, withdraws from NATO, developing multiple scenarios, how Germany reacts to that, how they face the war in Ukraine. And they look towards the UK to build that communications channel, which is a bit more challenging for them, being slightly further away mentally, culturally from the US. So I think the UK would be in a privileged position now to actually build those transatlantic ties and transatlantic dialogue, essentially, which I think geographically we were even created for. And be that not just intermediary between the two powers, but be the global power that it has the potential to be if we change things internally as well, and bring the world together in facing some of the most serious and challenging issues that we're up against today.
Thank you. Questions from our audience? We'll take 3 at a time, and we have 3 hands in the middle.
Can we do it one at a time?
One at a time.
Yeah.
We'll do it one at a time.
Yeah.
Alice is just coming with the microphone, but my left on the side. It's a bit vague, but...
Thanks. Andy Green. I spent last week in Nigeria, first as chair of Water Aid and secondly as a director of Airtel Africa, the sub-Saharan mobile operator. On the Wednesday, I chaired a session in Lagos, which is hugely threatened by climate change, by flooding and by salination of the water supplies. And we got the city government together with a load of bankers and in public sector, which is why I'm raising this, Lord Heseltine. What struck me is they'd not done it before. And it's not all about money, I think, what we could do in thinking about how do we help people with the knowledge we have of bringing together the public and the private sector and other things. I think there is a real significant opportunity for the UK to step forward and look at the problems that exist in these countries you were talking about where people will migrate from and begin to think about what expertise we can bring along with the money, because there's a lot of money floating around in the world, as you said, that can be brought together to resolve these types of issues if the right conversations can be made to happen. I just wondered your view on that, given what you've done regionally in the UK about that importance of bringing all those people together.
Well, my problem is that the policies I believe in, of the sort you talked about, the public-private partnership, are not part of the present philosophy of the government. The driving instinct of the government is tax cuts and let the private sector free. Now, I'm all for giving hope to the private sector, but it is so naive to think that you can solve these big problems by just letting the private sector free. And so I'm not quite sure what aspect of the government would go out to Nigeria to lecture them or explain to them or teach them about public-private partnership when the government themselves back home don't practice it. That's one of my anxieties about this government.
Questions? Gentleman in the middle, your hand was up first.
Thank you. Lord Heseltine, as a young person, it's very refreshing to hear a long-term plan for the future, especially one that seems quite bleak at times. I worry, though, that a Marshall Plan of this sort could end up becoming a sort of bribe to stop people from migrating to the UK and to other European countries. If we were to mitigate this potential problem, what would this aid come in the form of? And most importantly, to whom would it be delivered? Especially considering, as you said earlier, the rampant corruption in many of the recipient countries.
Yeah, well, you've hit a very important nail on the head. I mean, look, what I've outlined is dismissible with derision by practical politicians, because it's not going to happen, is it? And it's not going to happen because, A, the governments are not going to do it, B, because the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph will crucify anybody who becomes involved in the first step when they discover that the money went down the pockets of some crook in some outlandish part of the world. So it's not easy. But if I were in a position to start the process, first of all, I'd get involved in the detail. And that is a weakness in my position because I've never been involved in the detail, although I have been very involved in the detail in urban regeneration in this country. And it's that would guide me as to what I would do. And I would start by finding out very much on the ground what the potential was for these sort of ideas. Then I would try to find colleagues in Europe who were prepared to join in and so create bigger bangs for our buck in developing some examples of what this could all be about. And what I know as I say all this, but this again is from my experience in urban regeneration, there are no short-term solutions. Capital investment takes time, and the fruits of it are medium-term at best. So I'm fully aware that it's very easy to create a headline called a Marshall Plan. It would be extremely difficult to do, and it would be done step by step. A very important step would be to put the right minister into the department of the aid department, and a minister who was prepared to look at the capital investment side as well as the humanitarian side. And that would again, I mean, as I say it, I can see the headlines. People left to starve as new schools are built. You know, that would be the sort of thing that you would face.
Other questions? There's a hand closest to you, Alice. It was up, it's just gone down.
Should we look towards Europe or America in regulation of developing technologies like AI?
Well, there's no... the answer has to be Europe. I mean, I told you the story about Star Wars. The idea that we ourselves are going to become the leading edge of a technology so pervasive as AI is just, well, it's very good for a headline, and you can make wonderful speeches to party activists, but you can't actually look at yourself in a mirror and believe you told the truth. Europe could have a significant effect. Again, public-private partnership. I went to China in 1973, and I mean, that's a long time ago. It was a peasant economy. You've never seen anything quite like it. And I go back now. There's never been a transformation in human history on the scale of what the Chinese have achieved. And anyone who thinks that was done by the private sector, well, it's just too silly to think about.
I wonder, Aliona, if I can just take us back to the previous question, because there are examples, and I would say that Ukraine is one of those where we have provided support and money, and it has found the right people. Is that the case? Do you think that Ukraine is a good example of where the UK has provided support on quite a large scale, and it has found its way not into the pockets of the wrong people, but the right people?
I think most importantly, again, going back to talking about the UK setting the tone for the world, that's exactly what's been achieved with just generally supporting Ukraine in the war. If it wasn't for the United Kingdom, Europe, France and Germany, or the United States would not have gotten involved in so much military support for Ukraine. First point. Second point, when it comes to humanitarian aid, and I actually wanted to refer to that point, you can't really view a human life in such simplistic terms that maybe one tranche or one bribe could resolve everything. When a person makes a decision to move, especially when it's fleeing some extreme circumstances of life, and we're talking about real refugees and migrants who are suffering, not the hybrid ones, not the ones who are seeking to have some gain rather than fleeing really horrible circumstances. They're all leaving out of need and necessity, like Ukrainian refugees. Most of those women and children left their husbands, fathers, and brothers behind, and they do want to go back and help rebuild the country if they have something to go back to. So rebuilding Ukraine and investing in that, not just by governments, but creating those opportunities with private partnerships, that would be the key of actually getting Ukrainian refugees back home, settling them there, and even making some profit for companies who will essentially pay taxes in the UK and around the world and keep the economies going. And that is what Marshall Plan was about after the Second World War, and I think we can replicate that now. Humanitarian aid in Ukraine has definitely not been lost. I think that's one thing that's really reassuring. And I'm always very open talking about Ukraine having been the corrupt country in the 90s, and we did inherit that legacy from the Soviet Union. We are well on the way to getting rid of it, and only through partnerships with Western governments have we been able to achieve that. Because if it wasn't for that pressure towards our policymakers from the 90s throughout the 2000s, we would not have been able to eradicate that corruption. So unfortunately, that's the path that Western governments need to also take with developing countries in Africa, Asia, and across the world. You have to take those governments through that process, because if that tradition is not there and institutional memory is not there, that's an experience that you have to bring in along with the funds.
But you know, just listening to you talk, it just struck me. The rebuilding of the Ukraine, which is going to be very expensive, there will have to be some sort of plan.
Absolutely.
Well, what better plan than joining the European Union and therefore creating a climate in which public-private sector partnerships can flourish?
Yes.
So the Ukraine is actually a very interesting model, and I'm optimistic that once this war ends, and I have no ideas when that will be, but there will be, in large measure, massive aid for the Ukraine, coupled with the prospect of European membership.
Questions? Yep, hand just up here in the middle.
Thanks. I'm going to ask a light-hearted question, but a serious point first. I don't think, given the state of British politics at the moment, we should be too blasé about throwing accusations about corruption elsewhere. Lord Heseltine, if you had a call from David Cameron on Monday, what cabinet role would you have wanted and why?
Controversial.
Levelling up. Yeah, today, levelling up. Why? Because that is the way to get the British economy moving, by building on the strengths that exist and the people that exist in the disparate economies that make up our national economy, and to share with them the power of the central government to back the proposals that they design based on the local strengths and opportunities. I might actually ask if I could be Education Secretary as well, because I think it's quite extraordinary to me that we have wonderful schools in the private sector, but I'm thinking about the state sector. We have wonderful schools that get terrific results. And so why don't they all get results? And it's the old story. Show me the problem, show me the person in charge. And there is a tolerance of failing schools, which means failing head teachers. And nobody seems to be prepared to get rid of failing head teachers. It's I mean, that would be, if I was Education Secretary, I don't know what we're talking about global, but anyway, if I was Education Secretary, I would get a list of the failing schools. And everyone knows where they are. There's no secret. And I would say, have a very friendly conversation with the governors. I said, look, God, I'm so sympathetic to you, and isn't it awful? And I'll be back in 3 months, and I want a plan from you. Tell me what you're going to do. And if they didn't come up with a plan, then I'd take over the school. And they have the powers to do that. But the plan would have, in my mind, to involve changing the teacher. And every time I've ever seen a failing school transformed, the one characteristic is that they changed the head teacher. And one should not be too scathing about that, because the process broadly, you go up the ladder of classroom teaching, and you're a brilliant classroom teacher, and nobody should in any way underestimate the value that is. That's got nothing to do with running a 1,200 pupil comprehensive with a significant deprived community in the area where a lot of the parents don't work or don't make their children turn up on time and all that sort of thing. If you're a head teacher, you've got to get into that community. You've got to lead the community into an educational world which provides the opportunities. And the important thing is the same money goes into bad schools as goes into good schools. So the question is, how do you get the same money to always produce good results?
This gentleman here has been waiting patiently.
Thank you, Rob Merrick from the development website DevX. But can I also risk your wrath, Lord Heseltine, by asking you a domestic politics question, which is, can the return of David Cameron save the Tory party at the next election, or is this Conservative government beyond saving, even with him?
Sorry, how are we going to what?
Can the return of David Cameron save the Tory party at the next election, or is this Tory government, even with him, beyond saving?
Well, nobody can save the Conservative government unless they can save the economy. Elections are won or lost on a very simple test. How do I feel about my living standards? And if you feel the living standard is going all right, and you've been seeing better results a year or so, you don't want change, and you simply don't want the other guy to come in with a lot of newfangled ideas and change it. So the government gets re-elected. But if you have disgruntled people out there saying my living standards are terrible, the inflation is awful, and the bills are rising, and I can't afford that extra holiday, whatever it is, the opposition wins with the slogan, time for a change. And the best evidence that what I'm saying is true is that Rishi 2 days ago tried to relaunch himself as the guy for change, precisely because he knows that that is what the Labour Party will be saying, time for a change. And it's what we all do and all did. And I've been on both sides of the argument. I've been part of a team that won elections and part of a team that lost elections. So in the end, it's a pound in the pocket that determines who's going to win. And at the moment, the pound in the pocket is not likely to be very different a year from now than it is today.
We are at time, but I'm going to ask both our speakers to offer some final reflections. I'm going to give them 60 seconds each. Aliona, can I put you on the spot and ask you to try and accomplish that first?
I think I will be traditionally optimistic about where the world is going. Despite having a war back home, despite having a war in the Middle East that we all feel repercussions of, despite going into an extremely turbulent year of elections across the world that will inevitably shape the world that we will see in the future. Without any exaggeration, I think that will shape the future for our children, 2024, because we will see where the United States is going with its transatlantic partnership, whether there is a future for NATO, what's going to happen with the reformation of the United Nations and the UN Security Council, for example, where Europe will go with the elections in the European Union, whether the populist wing will win, given the lack of social cohesion across Europe, and something we're witnessing today on the streets of the United Kingdom. Despite all of that, I think if we keep focused, if we keep looking at the strategy, if we keep looking at our resources that we've got, all the experience that we've built, because that's something that doesn't get neglected or something you cannot just throw away. And that is something that the United Kingdom and the Western world has the legacy of. We know how to recover from major global crises, and I'm sure that that knowledge can be applied along with the new evolving technologies that are an extension of challenges, but they're also opportunities. So I think with all of that, with developing new framework of cooperation between governments and private sector, expanding international outreach, and forming new coalitions and alliances, I think we can all end up in a much better place in 2025, but we really need to stay focused.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd love to cheer that on, but I think there are two galvanizing forces at work. The first is global warming, which increasingly will persuade people that we're either going to do something about it or we're going to fry. I mean, civilization itself could easily be at the terminal end, and that is a positive global coalescing force. The other is nuclear weapons, that the tradition of 1,000 years, probably much longer, is that the elderly fail to take decisions and or take the wrong ones and then send the younger generations to die. I think that nuclear weapons have now so terrified the elder generations that they won't use them. And I have a sort of feeling that if you look at the awfulness in the world today, which I think in any other century could have blown up into red war, but one detects that the leaders of the world, how awful many of them are, just know they have got to stop the thing escalating. So I think that the chances are that humankind will survive. There'll be lots of nasty experiences, lots of nasty people, because there always have been. And I always say to my friends, read Shakespeare. It's all there.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're slightly over time, so that is all the time that we have. Thank you all so much for being part of this conversation. Please join us for a drink next door if you can. Thank you to our excellent speakers, Aliona and Lord Heseltine. And finally, please can we show our appreciation to our speakers in the usual way.